like to go ahead now and have Ms. Yavi just give us a 2-minute introduction about who you are and the work that you're doing on the continent. Welcome, Yavi.
Thank you, Anne. Well, according to yesterday's or the day before yesterday's news, the Kenyans can now come to South Africa for your medical treatments without issues. And on that note, so I'm not in South Africa, so it's about 6 o'clock my time. So please excuse me if I've got too many lights on and it's right. I'm the Executive Director of PABWA, the Pan-African Business Women's Association, as you said, the think tank for economic transformation of Africa. We have a special focus on women and youth, but also I am the co-founder of the recently launched $1 billion Africa Prosperity Fund, which was launched by President Nana Akufo-Addo at the Global Citizen Festival in Accra last month. And that is focused on driving industrialization and literally creating African billionaires in the right way and for the right reasons in terms of investment into Africa. My favorite saying is that Mother Nature blessed Mother Africa in a sisterhood long before the sisterhoods even existed, with riches beyond our wildest imaginations. So as a mother myself to a next generation, I'm embarrassed that I cannot hand over a continent that is wealthy and is according to what is in our ground, so to speak, what has been naturally blessed to this continent. And we have to change that in our lifetime. And that is what my life's work is about. Right now, actually, where I am and what I'm doing is actually very critical to the future of trade and the future of AfCFTA on the continent. I'm chairing the African Union Free Movement Protocol sensitization sessions, the FMP and MPFA, which is the Free Movement Protocol and the Migration Policy Framework of Africa in itself, which determines the success of the AfCFTA and how well it will be a success, and trade in general, not just under the AfCFTA. Just in terms of a landmark event, you know, we spoke about South Africa and Kenya having no visas in terms of 90 days, et cetera, et cetera. So what that means is that simply it means that when you say free movement, it's not really free. It simply means no visas. It doesn't mean there's not going to be borders. It means that the borders are friendly. It means that the borders welcome each other in terms of our brotherhood and sisterhood and not treat each other as enemies. And that for me is where the crux of the AfCFTA lies. And the work that we focus on and the work that we are doing is how do we create the unity behind the AfCFTA that it was intended for and it was created for. And all of these policies, regulations, processes have to be looked at in terms of that and not just looking at it from one perspective. And then just obviously, lastly, just in terms of the fund and the areas of focus that we focus on, and Ms. Boholo spoke about it in terms of funding and looking at it from an investment perspective, is that we've got 10 ring-fenced funding areas under the African Prosperity Fund, and that is environmental sustainability in terms of climate change, youth inclusion, which we call Y, the AfCFTA intra-Africa trade, digitalization and technology, healthcare, entrepreneurship, African industrialization and wealth creation, food and food security and agriculture, infrastructure development, education and evolution. So that is what is keeping me busy and out of trouble. And yeah, that is what is the focus areas in terms of PABWA and the African Prosperity Fund. Thank you for having us, Anne. I'm just going to give you some highlights, and I'll talk about one thing in particular, just so that we obviously keep it short and keep it tight. I'll start with the latest, is that obviously now I'm busy with the FMP, but just prior to that, in August this year, we were the only organization that submitted, or as far as I know, that submitted a policy brief on the, as you know, the negotiations for the various protocols are underway. The investment one, as Ms. Bokolo spoke about, has been concluded, but the Women and Youth in Trade protocol is still part of the second phase of the negotiations. We were the only ones who submitted a policy brief, and we just started the research. And as you can imagine, we had to do a lot of research on the ground, purely because it's with cross-border traders. And we started it literally a month before COVID started. So it was a very long 2 years of research to do and to finalize that policy brief. It should have taken us 6 months. It took us 2 years and a bit. But I think what it did was, because it took a longer time and because we had to reach out digitally, it actually became a nightmare to deal with. But because of that, we were able to access more people. Actually, we were able to access various levels. We were able to access different types of, the actual stuff that was happening on the ground, and the craziness, if I can put it that way, of the fact that people were no longer allowed to move around, and what that did to the women and youth on the ground. So from a cross-border trade perspective, our policy brief gave us more than we bargained for. But I just want to talk about it in 2 seconds, is that when we looked at it, one of the biggest things that emerged out of the policy brief, or out of the research, and it's in the policy brief, is what we call the precursors. And it wasn't intended to be part of the policy brief. I mean, a policy brief is a very general structure. It's nothing, nothing special. You kind of just provide the research, plug it into the various places, and that's where it is. And then we were put into a corner, pushed into a corner, where we looked at it, and there needed to be certain things, or preconditions rather, that needed to be in place before certain aspects of the AfCFTA, specifically the Women and Youth in Trade Protocol, could be implemented. So those preconditions / precursors, and there's 8 of them that we picked up. Obviously, there could be more. We looked at the ones, we had to go according to the research, and that is what, that told us that there are these 8 preconditions that need to be resolved. The one needed to be, it's completely urgent and critical, and actually have it marked in red in the policy brief, and that is corruption, insecurity, and gender-based harassment and violence against women and their children that are traveling across the borders for the purposes of cross-border trade. So this was the biggest issue. They also highlighted it as some of the, it's life-threatening. The other 7 are limited access for finance for women. And we know that this is one of the biggest on the continent. I mean, that's why Regal Africa Group exists, is that, access to finance for women is just almost impossible in certain parts of the continent. Measurement, monitoring, and evaluation. So we've got all these lovely policies. It's the true African way to have lovely policies and documents and all of those kind of things. But implementation and then monitoring and evaluation is elusive to us in most cases. And therein lies the gaps for corruption, et cetera, et cetera. The continued exclusion of the informal sector of the African economy. So we look at the African economy, we only take into account the formal sector. However, 70% across Africa, as you know, comes from the informal economy, because certain small countries rely mostly on the informal economy. So us, by looking at it and only including the formal sector, we are actually by default excluding women, because women make up 80% of the informal economy. So we don't have an understanding of their value contribution. And because we don't have an understanding of their value contribution, we don't pay attention to their issues, challenges, and the things that arise, like sexual harassment and violence at cross-border trade posts. Inconsistent gender mainstreaming across countries. So for example, I just want to give this to you very quickly, is that 2010-2020 was the African Women's Decade, declared by African Union in 2010 at the summit. We got 0.000 outcome out of 10 years of a decade that was declared and accepted and ratified by all heads of state. We are now sitting in the 2nd year of the African Women's Decade of Financial and Economic Inclusion. We're almost in year 3. We have no idea where we are. Yes, absolutely, the deputy chairperson, yes, absolutely, the gender directorate is telling us that there's things coming, but we are in year 3, so we are 1/3 of the way through. So there is inconsistent gender mainstreaming, because we can't even get the information out of certain countries to tell us where they are with their policies and processes. For example, procurement was meant to have been at least 33% to women-owned businesses from public sector. Nobody knows what it is across the continent. Only 3 countries have submitted their figures, and it's way below 10%. And the last is that it's poor or non-existent infrastructure and basic facilities for women when it comes to cross-border trade. And I'm specifically now speaking to the cross-border traders and not you and I that are sitting in our offices or in our hotel rooms. I'm talking specifically the ones that are sitting at the borders who have like simple things like there's no toilets, there's no safety areas or safe spaces for them to be. And all of those kind of things create issues that cannot be controlled. So these were some of the preconditions that came out that said, if we don't have these kind of things that are at least at a majority or at least have started on the continent in some shape or form, how is the AfCFTA protocol on women and youth in trade going to actually be implemented? And how will it be driven? Because these things these are the preconditions in order for it to be able to be built upon. You can't build a house without a strong foundation. So this is just, obviously just an indication of some of the work. The last, I suppose the thing before that is that we are in the second year of the AfCFTA Media Fellowship, where we train media and journalists on the AfCFTA so that they're able to write about it properly, if I can put it that way. And that's just some of the work that we are. You can hear I'm very passionate about it. So it's some of the work that we do.
So can you share with us what you see is the role of technology as we push development on the continent, especially when we talk about AfCFTA and making sure that our goods, our services are consumed on the continent and we have more intra-Africa trade? What is the role of technology? Welcome, Yavi.
Thank you. The whole thing about digitalization, and I'm a techie first before I'm anything else. So once the AfCFTA operationalizes, it is going to be digitalization that activates it. And when I say activates it, meaning that it's not activated as yet, and truly, fully, functionally, where we are using it, where it's, and I loved what our keynote speaker said when she said the AfCFTA is not at the Secretariat. The AfCFTA is with us. SG Wamkemene always says that the AfCFTA is not him. The AfCFTA is for Africa's 1.3 billion people. And therein lies the issue around digitalization, because actually the fact that COVID came, actually the fact that it was delayed by a couple of months in terms of the opera or coming into effect, meant that we all had to take to online platforms to start driving the AfCFTA agenda, to start talking about the AfCFTA agenda. And you and I are here. We have never met each other, but we have spoken so many times on platforms and channels about the AfCFTA. We are here because of digitalization. We are here, and how many people have you engaged with from a digital perspective on the AfCFTA? So from a technology aspect, the digitalization and the impact on AfCFTA has already started to happen. However, when we look at it now in terms of activation, the accelerator is next going to be trade and services, like Walid spoke about. Technology fast-tracked the way we work in the world of work, and the future of work that we used to speak about is now our current and our present. So when we look at it, the world of work has changed. The way we engage has changed. You and I couldn't be at one conference and be at your conference at the same time. Our keynote speaker could never have done that. The world of work has changed. And because of that, the AfCFTA trade agenda is going to change because of services. Technically, we are providing services right now. And that means that things like management consulting, legal advice, medical advice, et cetera, that becomes exponentially larger in terms of trade and services. So that next accelerator under the AfCFTA is going to be trade and services. And a key component of that is going to be the ability to be able to use digital or digitalization in terms of being able to activate it. And then secondly, slash lastly, is that because I won't go into too much detail, is the e-commerce platforms. So when we look at it, we live in the platform economy. Africa had the most number of e-commerce platform startups in the last 2 to 3 years over COVID. Kenya is obviously a hub in terms of technology and digitalization, so a lot came out of there. But, and this is what I foresee, I'm not saying that it's happening already. I'm saying that this is what I think is going to happen. So I could be very, very badly wrong. But in terms of our research at PABWA, in terms of our, our think tank, this is what we're coming up with at the moment. Our research is not finished, is that we are going to have to diversify before we can scale. And what do I mean by that? Is that we need to accept and understand that Africa's trust deficit means that our e-commerce platforms will have an explosive start. So it has already had an explosive start. It's massive, it's huge, we take off. Everybody wants to sell online. Everybody wants to create services online, training platforms, all of those kind of things are happening. However, it could easily just fizzle out if we don't build levels of trust through verification and back-out processes. In order to build that trust over a long period of time. So we've got short-term plans, we need to have medium-term issues, risk management, and we need to have long-term accountability. We have to show intention and we have to show willingness to be trusted. So that comes across maybe in our marketing, maybe that comes across in our communication. So therein lies the connection between, or the intersection of technology and humanity, or in our case, as ABSA likes to call it, our Africanacity, right? So that intersection is where digital and communication and the humanity will come forward, is that we now need to create that trust in our digital and online reach. And linked to that, is our PAPS, obviously. So when PAPS was launched, that was a key indicator for us, for the rest of us, from the Secretariat, from the African powers that be, is that trade under the AfCFTA is going to be optimized through digital payments. So here's my issue. Obviously, because there's guarantees within within the PAP system. There's levels of trust that I was just talking about that already is there because it's a Frexim bank, etc., etc., etc. So let's consider what that means now for the digital divide in Africa. You know, those preconditions I was speaking about earlier, the digital divide in Africa, because if we are driving an agenda of digital payments, what happens to the people who are not or don't have access to digital and online? And worse is the gender digital divide, which is the largest in the world. So these are the kind of things that we need to look at from a digitalization perspective, both positive and negative, in terms of implementation and going forward, and how the AfCFTA will be impacted. And I'm sure your digital trade section tomorrow or today, I'm not sure, is going to kind of unpack that in a much more detailed way, and you'll get more technical feedback. Yeah, that's just kind of the overarching things that we're picking up from our research and development and our knowledge base.
We have a question here from Laun Daga. She talks about, her question is, innovation is key to industrialization in Africa. As we saw with COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the innovation came from the informal sector. Part of what makes innovation easy in the informal sector is the lack of red tape and prohibitive startup costs that are associated with formalization. So, but then she adds on to say, however, industrial policies tend to speak formality. Is there space for designing new measures of innovation in Africa that include the informal sector? And how do we ensure the push for formality does not stifle innovation? So a couple of things here, innovation and the informal economy, right? We're pushing the agenda for formalization. I know I push that, maybe because I come from a finance background, I can't lend to the informal sector, honestly. So we need more formalized businesses on the continent. But her question really is around innovation and the informal sector. Welcome, Yavi.
Absolutely. I think it's exactly that, right? So if you look at it, and there is something happening on the continent at the moment. It's not very far ahead, but it's somewhere. So if you look at it, so obviously I also come from a finance background, so everything's got to be a certain way and certain structures. However, we live in a world where our credits and our banking systems were structured by the colonization era. So, you know, people had streets and houses and those kind of things in most parts of our colonization or colonizer countries. But Africa doesn't look like that. Africa has parts that have got informal settlements. You know, I'm looking at one through my window across the way, you know, so this is where we are at. So how do we now use technology to be able to create structures, become innovative in terms of the African life? How do we start to get, so one of the things that I think, just to cut this short, one of the things that I think we need to look at, and as I said, it's already starting to be looked at, is that we need to have a technology-based system that is able to capture data and information that then conforms to the formal structures of banking. So for example, if mama is sitting on the side of the road and selling her, you know, her honey or her wares or whatever the case is that she's sitting on the side of the road, that is an informal sector. She gets cash. There is no way of tracking, first of all, her domicilium, which the credit system requires, her ID document, which a credit system requires and which she may have. But more importantly, there's no way of tracking her business and her business activity, which is what all banks and all financial structures would require. So what if, and all of us have a little thing called, a little thing called a mobile device or some kind of device, even mama sitting on the side of the road. How do we use that piece of equipment to be able to track those transactions and then formalize those transactions? Because it is not about the transactions not happening, it's about the transactions not being formally tracked. That becomes the issue from a financial perspective. So innovation and innovative thinking, as I said, the intersection of humanity and technology is going to be how the AfCFTA starts to become a success in terms of digitalization. And that is what I'm giving you, one simple example of how we need to look at stuff in order to be able to say, right, fine, here is activity. How do we track activity differently? Because it's not coming into a bank account, or is there a way to be able to track certain things, to be able to get management accounts, for example, and not necessarily financial statements, so she can get $500 or $1,000. It doesn't have to be $50,000. And therein lies the story of access to finance in terms of the informal sector. I'm literally just giving you one silly example. There are obviously 100 behind it that we could explore at a different time.
Mrs. Yavi, could you share with us your last remarks and also tie that in regards to game changer to make sure AfCFTA is successful?
Well, Dr. Hamajin gave me the segue in. One of the things that we're not talking about it because we don't like to talk about it as Africa, or we only talk about it when something happens, or we're not, I don't know what the reason is that we're not talking about it. But whenever I mention it, people kind of just, you know, they look at me strangely. And unfortunately, those things don't bother me. But here's my issue. In a continent that is fraught with xenophobia, where people land in my country and they are treated like enemies. We land in some other country and foreigners are treated better than us. So we are a continent that is fraught with xenophobia. We don't treat each other like brothers and sisters. We say brothers and sisters. We don't treat each other like that from a policy, regulation, and framework perspective. We now want to trade with each other. How? How are we now going to create desirability for each other's products when we don't even like each other, if I can put it that way? We like each other sometimes. We like some of each other. We don't necessarily like all of each other. All 55 nations don't necessarily love each other dearly, and for various reasons. But the point I'm trying to make is that the AfCFTA is a channel. The AfCFTA makes it easier for us to trade. The AfCFTA removes boundaries and challenges and obstacles and whatever else. It doesn't force us to trade. So we need to start. There's a Made in Africa protocol, there's rules of origin, there's all of these kind of policies and processes, and once again, documentation that is going to instruct us and dictate to us about how it will be done. But no one is talking about the psychology of wanting to buy from each other. So the reason I said it's a segue from Dr. Hamajin is because when are we going to enjoy the fact that we don't want a suit from Italy, but we actually want a suit from Kenya? When do we enjoy the fact that we don't want French champagne, we actually want Méthode Cap Classique from South Africa? When are we going to understand that that is what we want? But when are we going to want it? And that is the psychology of it. So we can have lots of policies. The AfCFTA will be implemented. It will be operationalized because there's all of us driving it from behind the scenes. But it's going to come down to where the people actually want to buy. You can have as many e-commerce platforms. You can have as much PAPs as you want to. If I don't want to buy from another African country, I'm not going to. So brand Africa and African made and made in Africa and all of those kind of things are lovely, but we now need to start driving the psychology of unity and not just talking about it. I must want to buy things from other African countries. I'm the consumer, and therein lies, I think, the biggest game changer is our psychology. It's our humanity that now needs to be looked at from a unity perspective. So for me, that's the biggest thing, is that how do we get past that? And should we not be looking at a brand Africa agenda now and not later on, you know, when everything is operationalized? So this is just my kind, and obviously social media and digital media give us the option to do that. So how are we going to use that and those kind of things? But for me, that's the biggest issue around the game changer that we are not necessarily seeing, or we've seen it, we don't want to talk about it, you know, that angle, but it is there and it needs to be addressed.